Well, good morning, everybody. It's a Monday, and it's September 14th. We are rapidly approaching the middle of this month. Hard to believe. This year has been zipping right along, in spite of all the craziness that we've had going on. So, if you remember, on Saturday, we left off with Jesus having traveled down to Capernaum and to gone to the synagogue and done the healing of the man that was possessed with an unclean spirit, though at times it was plural. So we have that. One of the things we didn't mention about that is that it says he went down to Capernaum. Now, if you look at from Nazareth to Capernaum, Nazareth is, if you were to walk cross country, it would be about like walking to Carroll. So it's roughly 20-ish miles if you go cross country. If you travel by highway, it's closer to 30. So it'd be more like walking to Auburn, then to Carroll, then to Glidden. But I believe you were, with the topography, you'd be able to walk cross country. So it'd be more like walking to Carroll. So it's a bit of a walk. It's not something you just take off and do. Oh, I think I'll walk there today. It would take you the better part of the day to get there, or a fair some of the day, depending on how fast you were able to walk. But the thing is it's north. You're heading east and you're heading north. So to us, when we talk about that, we would say we were going to go up to Capernaum, right? Because we typically talk about up, talking about north and south. We go down when we go south. We go up when we go north. But that's not the way they talked over there, or the way they do talk, because if you look at the elevation, and one of the strange things about being in the Holy Land is the elevation of so much of it. You are below sea level quite a bit of the time, especially when you're around the Sea of Galilee. So if we look at the elevation of Lake City here where we're at, we're sitting at about 1,240 feet above sea level here. So about 1,240 feet. Now Nazareth is similar. It's about 1,145 feet above sea level. So it's roughly about the same elevation as we are in Lake City. Isn't that cool? But Capernaum, you are walking down. You're walking down to 682 feet below sea level. So you're almost 700 feet below the level of the ocean, and that for us in the Midwest is really kind of hard to get used to. And that was one of the stranger things about being in Israel, was the majority, or the percentage of the time that we were below sea level was really strange. So today we are looking at Luke chapter 4. We're looking at verses 38 and 39. We're still in Capernaum, and this is Capernaum now is going to become Jesus' base, is his home base. All right. Now we have one thing we want to bear in mind: he's not called the disciples yet. He hasn't called Peter yet, but yet in this story we are going to Peter's home. All right, and that's what's going on here. Peter's home in Capernaum. They believe they have found it, and they've built a Catholic church over the top of it. It's a rather peculiar looking. It looks almost like a UFO perched over the top of it. One of the things in the Holy Land, if they find a holy site, or they believe it's a holy site, or they can claim to be a holy site, they build a church there. And a church is on top of it. So here you have a Catholic church that's perched kind of almost on little braces, and like I said, it almost looks like a UFO, and it's right adjacent to the synagogue in Capernaum. Now that's not now, though it may be the same site, that's not the synagogue that Jesus would have been to. It's a much later synagogue that was built there, but it would have, in its day, that synagogue would have been an amazing facility. But excuse me, the home they believe to be Peter's home sits directly below this church, and there's a window in the middle of the church where you can look down upon what they believe to be the home of Peter, St. Peter. And that's actually one of the more moving places in Israel. It really was very touching to look down and to realize, even if this isn't the house of Peter, you could see the street. Now, of course, the street isn't like a street we have here. It's very narrow, and it's stone street, and it was for carts and walking. It's not for cars by any stretch, because of course they didn't have cars down. So it's a narrow pathway, but you can see the street walking by what was this old house. So there's no doubt in the city of Capernaum that even if this wasn't the actual house of Peter, though they believe it to be. Um, if it wasn't, Jesus almost certainly walked on that street beside that building. And so to look down on that, to be walking around in that area where they've dug down to the street level from the time of Christ, that's very humbling. Very it's a very strange sensation. It's a really very interesting and very touching and cool. So, at any rate, we did go to visit this house we're talking about today. They believe to be the house we're talking about today. So it is something that's very cool. And if you ever get to Israel, make sure you go see Peter's home, and also make sure that you go not too far from there on the Sea of Galilee also, because Capernaum is right on the Sea of Galilee. Okay, it's right there on the shore. That's because it's a fishing village. Okay, and so it's right there. Or it was right there anyway during Jesus' time. But near there's a display where they have a fishing boat that's from the time of Christ. That's another really moving thing, to see that boat and realize that something very much like this is where Jesus is out still in the storm, out on the Sea of Galilee. And you go out on the Sea of Galilee, and we went out there. It was kind of rainy and stormy when we were out there, so it really was kind of cool. Kind of drove that whole story about calming the storm home. It wasn't really windy or anything, but the clouds were hazy, and it was actually pretty quiet, but it was, there was rain coming down, and so it kind of helped make that story feel very real. So anyway, with that, let's look at the healing at Simon's house, is what we're talking about. So chapter 4 of Luke, 38 and 39 only today. Short little bit that we're looking at because I've talked a lot leading up. All right, 38, 39. After leaving the synagogue, he entered Simon's house. Now Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever, and they asked him about her. Then he stood over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her. Immediately she got up and began to serve them. Okay, now this is one of those verses where sometimes people, well, for crying out loud, Jesus just needed somebody to cook supper, and so he went in and healed the woman. That was his motive. It almost can feel that way, but that's not really what's going on. I don't think. That's not the right way to look at this, I don't think. First of all, when Luke is using the verbiage here and it translated as high fever here in the NRSV, he's actually using a first century medical term, because they had two different terms to differentiate between a low grade fever and a serious fever. A fever that was serious indicates serious illness and something to be concerned about. And that's the word we have here. She's got a actual high fever, and it's a problem. It's not good. It means she's actually, she's quite ill. We can have different things. Sometimes I think when I've got my sinuses acting up, some days I think I'm running a bit of a low-grade fever just because my body's fighting with that sinus problem. But I don't have high fevers. And so that's what's going on here. It's actually medical terms. One of those things it indicates to us, makes us think that this is Luke the physician, because he's using medical terminology here. And he does in other places too in the gospel. So Jesus is concerned for the woman. They mention to her that she's ill. And so he goes in and he doesn't rebuke her. He's not criticizing her and saying, "Hey, woman, get up and come on, snap to it and get up here and cook some stew for us," or whatever. No, he goes in and rebukes the fever, not the woman, not Peter's mother-in-law. So he drives whatever is, it's reminiscent of the healing of the man with the demon before. And remember, in first century, they would have thought that any illness and anything that was going on was a demonic type of a thing. That's just the way they thought. No, I'm not going to say that there's not necessarily demonic things in this day and age. That's entirely possible. But we understand germs, and we understand that when you have a fever, you probably got a viral or bacterial infection, or something like that, or something else that's going on that your body is trying to fight off some kind of an infection normally with a fever. So at any rate, he rebukes the fever and heals Peter's mother-in-law, and she's healed. And so she immediately then gets up and not only serves Jesus, but serves all those that are gathered there. Now, Jesus hasn't yet called his disciples. That's calling the first disciples. That's coming up day after tomorrow. Okay, so we're going to get to Wednesday before we start calling disciples here. So we don't really know who's gathered at the house. There people that have followed along with Jesus, curious people, or is it just that, we don't have Peter inviting him into the house? Somehow or another, he comes to eat at Peter's house. Interesting, at least in Luke's rendition of the story. So she gets up to serve, and so this is when we look at this. What can we take away from this as a life application? How does this speak to us into our life, into our world? And I think the thing that we need to look at that and think about is that when Jesus comes into our life, when he heals us, when he removes that's making us ill, and spiritual illness is what we're really looking at here, not physical illness. Because remember, they're thinking of this fever as being demonic, right? It's a spiritual issue. It's not a physical issue per se. It's a spiritual issue that's manifests itself as a physical issue in their eyes. And many times I think spiritual issues can manifest themselves as physical things. It can make us tired and worn out and depressed, and of course that's an emotional issue. But so spiritual can spill into these other things. And so Jesus has healed her spiritually. He's brought her back to the norm, and he is in her presence. He is in her life now. And so when we see this, and when we have this in our life, when Jesus comes in and heals us, when he comes into our life, what are we supposed to do? I think we're supposed to emulate Peter's mother-in-law. We're supposed to immediately get up and serve him, and serve those that are also his followers. So it's not, how do you love God? You love his children. So I think that's the message out of these short 2 verses. I think that's what it's telling us, is that when Jesus truly comes into our lives, when he truly relieves us of all this pain and anguish and this fever of our spirit, that we need to get up and serve him. So let's do that today. Let's serve him by being a blessing to someone today. That was a good segue into my old saying, isn't it? So with that, I'm going to let you go. We've gone about as long as I'm trying to keep these around 9 to 12 minutes at the top. So we're about 12 minutes in. So let's have a great week and come back tomorrow, and we'll finish up chapter 4. And then we can start calling disciples, and that'll be cool. See you in the morning, 9 a.m. Have a great one. Bye-bye.